Call me Louis. This is my sport. LuiSpot.
Now let's find out what the controversy is.
There was an interesting debate aired on Black Journal, 1974. Before you begin, let's start by identifying people featured on this tape. You see at least 3 people. There's a moderator on the center who will be picking audience questions from the calls and directing sides of the question. The woman on the left is Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. She wrote the Cress theory of color confrontation and racism papers. According to her line of work as a physician, Dr. Cress realized racism was the #1 cause of mental health problems in America and wanted to understand more. In her research, she came to find out racism was an entire system created for sole purpose of white genetic survival. Cress papers have never been disputed to this day.
Well, my theory was, I wrote the paper in 1969. I wrote a paper called The Cress Theory of Color Confrontation and Racism. And the sole reason behind writing that paper was an attempt to understand the behavior of white people in relationship to all people of color, every place in the world, black, brown, red, and yellow people. And the paper was presented to the Americans at the National Medical Association, the section on psychiatry in neurology, because back in 1969, the Black Caucus in the American Psychiatric Association, we had said that racism, and when we talk about racism, we're talking about the white supremacy behavior of white people. That racism was the #1 mental health problem in the nation, and it was the #1 cause of other mental health problems. And I wanted to understand what this thing of racism really is all about, because it's the thing that has caused woe and misery and suffering for the vast majority of the people on this planet that are classified as non-white. And in my attempt to understand why the necessity of white people to keep saying that white is superior and that the condition of non-white is inferior, and the more I thought about it, in conjunction with an idea that a friend of mine had, that racism was a worldwide behavioral system for the maintenance of white supremacy by a small minority of people, I put those ideas together with what we know about genetics, what we know about the condition of skin whiteness itself. The condition of skin whiteness is the genetic inability to produce skin pigment called melanin. This is a genetic recessive trait. It is a genetic deficiency state, not as defined by Cress Welsing, but defined by geneticists and dermatologists, that the inability to produce the skin pigment of melanin or melanin pigment is described as albinism. And I think that white people, even though most white people are not consciously understanding their problem in genetics, they are certainly aware that they are genetically dominated by people of color. That's why it was a statement, one drop of black blood makes you black, because people of color have the genetic capacity to annihilate white people. And so unless white people control the reproductivity of people of color, then we can postulate that perhaps one day there won't be any white people. And I think that the very survival of white people necessitates that they project genetic inferiority on people of color, because it is they who really are aware that they are genetic recessive and perhaps genetically inferior to people of color.
The man on the right is Dr. William Shockley, a physicist and a Nobel Prize laureate for the discovery of transistors in 1956. And the reason he was invited to this debate was not physics, but the fact that Dr. Shockley openly supported eugenics.
I would like to ask a question, and Dr. Shockley, if you could answer it yes or no, I would appreciate it. Do you believe that black people are inferior in intelligence because of their heredity?
I have a standard statement. It is not yes or no. It's memorized. I say it at the same time every time, I think. What I say is this: my research leads me, and it's a tragic conclusion really, my research leads me inescapably to the opinion that the major cause of the American Negro's intellectual and social deficits is hereditary and racially genetic in origin, and thus not remediable to a major degree by practical improvements in environment.
All right, if you believe that the position relatively of black Americans to white Americans is based on a genetic inferiority, and I will accept the responsibility for that word, then what do you see as the solution to the problem?
Well, I see the first aspect of this is to prevent the problem from becoming worse by dysgenics.
Let me break down two things for the importance of understanding. Eugenics is the maintaining or control of good genetic traits. The keyword here is control. Dysgenic, on the other hand, is a theory which believes undesirable characteristics can be passed on later generations through inheritance and is therefore considered undesirable to produce. So these kind of traits are highly controlled as well. Dr. Shockley believed intelligence was hereditary and also believed blacks as a group were less intelligent than whites. To illustrate his points, Dr. Shockley opens two charts, one comparing visual acuity of races. Visual acuity is the ability of the eye to distinguish shapes and details of objects at a given distance, and the other comparing number of children per woman. All comparisons which backfires heavily.
Also, just 1 second. Hello, go ahead please, you're on Black Journal.
I would like to ask the question, why does the doctor feel that his theory, Dr. Shockley, why does he feel that your theory is correct?
You see, Dr. Shockley believed the more intelligent, the less kids you'll have. So he compares the number of kids of both whites and black people living in rural areas and those of college graduates.
Well, let me say that's a long question. Let me point out one aspect. It's a question that calls for a very long answer. I think I might just at this point say that in a time like 1 hour, we may expose a problem and encourage thinking about it, and this is a very valuable thing. But to cover either Dr. Welsing's views or mine, and let me say here are, just to show that these things exist, is a pamphlet that she was good enough to give me some time ago.
This one's upside down.
Well, that one's upside down.
Yeah,
thank you.
Right.
And this is one of my own. It's actually a collection of a debate.
The imperatives of ethnic education is yours.
This is the issue of the journal. Mine was, the title of my paper is somewhat different from this, but I want to say that speaking for myself, if people would like to write to me at Stanford University, I have a post box there, post box S, which is the same as Shockley and Stanford. I will try to supply more information, and I'm sure Dr. Welsing will say what she can do about telling people how to reach her pamphlet. Okay. But now let me say this chart that I held up a moment ago is very important in respect to this question of why I think there may be what proves a basic difference. But I'm going to say that if there were not a basic difference in intellectual capacity in the past, there probably will be a basic difference between black and white intellectual capacity in the future, simply because of the reproduction patterns. And these are Census Bureau data, and this is the most threatening aspect. And what it indicates is that for the black women of the lowest intellectual social class, which are rural farm women, generally the education is least, the average number of children is 5.4. For women with college degrees, it's 1.9. And so this is definitely unfavorable. It is reproducing far more at the bottom end and not enough to keep even at the top end.
Dr. Shockley, can
for
you
whites,
explain?
let me just finish this. For whites, the numbers are also in this direction, but nowhere nearly as severe.
Now right at this point, if this chart was something to go by, let's forget the lowest end. Dr. Francis will deal with that later. The top end, 1.9 versus 2.3. Could it mean black women who are graduates had more intellectual capacity than white counterparts? Yet he chooses to say this instead.
So this is definitely unfavorable. It is reproducing far more at the bottom end and not enough to keep even at the top end.
It's for this reason Dr. Shockley was accused of having racist theory, to the point of his death in 1989. Something he only said was to destroy his self-esteem.
Dr. Shockley, you are accused of having a theory that is a white racist theory. How do you respond to that?
Well, I respond to that by saying that I've considered whether or not I am a racist. Racist is an epithet that used to damage my self-esteem, but it doesn't anymore. I feel it's untrue. If you look in the dictionary as to what racist means, it means emotional feelings, irrational feelings associated with fear and hate. If I really had those, I don't think I would be here this evening. I feel that what I'm engaged in is a demand for diagnosis, and I'd like to say some more about this chart, which we'll come to probably later, which shows the disproportionate rates of reproduction for the least effective elements of the black community. I'd like to say more about that than we should in just this brief introduction. But I think there is another word that better describes what I'm involved in, and that word is raceology, which means a scientific analysis of racial differences. And basically, I have a faith that reason is a good thing, and I feel as you do about the First Amendment, but maybe with a slightly different emphasis. I think the really important thing about the First Amendment is it is a way of guaranteeing a high likelihood that truth will emerge as a result of conflicting ideas being expressed, and I have a thesis and a basic belief that truth is a good thing and will be of benefit to man.
The rest of the debate is Dr. Shockley destroying his own self with his own theories.
Dr. Shockley, I think that in all fairness, you should explain to the audience why it is that you have, first of all, you have a very large segment of the black population who are on farms, who are deprived in cities. Why don't you explain at the time that you're showing this, who is keeping black people in a situation like they're in? I mean, it could be, you could turn it around the other way, where you could have very large numbers of black people who are exposed to educational opportunities like white people, who are exposed to housing, who are exposed to health facilities. Why don't you explain that at the same time that you put figures like that?
I'm sure you would explain it,
no, but
Dr.
I think
Welsing,
it's important
but
in
one must say first things first. And you've raised the basic question there, and that is whether the disadvantages are primarily a lack of opportunity or whether they are primarily a basic genetic difference. And let me mention one thing, which is that in certain areas there is no doubt about black superiority. Blacks are superior in visual acuity, and they're superior in a systematic way. Now, I don't expect that people will understand the details of this, but I simply want to show that quantitative work can be done. This happens to be a research job of my own, and what it shows, because these points that you see here lie on a line which is not the central line, but they lie systematically on a line. What it says is that so far as visual acuity is concerned, blacks are systematically better than whites. It's as if their bell-shaped curve, their distribution curve, were pushed upwards compared to whites for visual acuity, or at least for the avoidance of bad eyesight, such that if the same shift occurred for IQ, it would mean that the average IQ distribution would be up by 9 points rather than down by about 15 points, which is the typical average.
Dr. Shockley, visual acuity is probably something that the system of white supremacy has not necessarily seen the need to affect the environment that black people are in so that it will alter the fact that they have visual acuity that is superior to whites. The fact of visual acuity is not attacked in the same way as educational opportunity and job performance is attacked. And I think that
it's evidence for a genetic difference, in
well,
my
you see what
opinion.
I'm saying? There might be many, many more genetic differences where people of color appear superior.
If I may, we have a number of people, and we'd like to get to as many as possible. If you could make your answers as, not to compromise your explanation, but if you could make your answers as succinct, I would appreciate it, because we would like to involve the public as much as we can. One moment, please. You're on Black Journal. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I was wondering if Dr. Shockley could explain the basic difference between the course he is taking in explaining white supremacy and the course that Hitler took during the Nazism reign.
Thank you.
Well, there are enormous differences. In fact, the lesson to be learned from Nazi history is frequently very misunderstood. And it is a lesson which Mr. Brown has told us about earlier. It's the First Amendment. It's not that eugenics is intolerable. Actually, the eugenic programs, which are the opposite of dysgenics, eugenic programs are not inconceivable. They're not inhumane. Denmark has been carrying out programs with strong eugenic implications for maybe 30 years. And it's important to note that since World War II, Denmark's per capita homicide rate dropped and is now approximately 1/20th. That is, the number of deaths of probability being killed in a year by a violent homicide is roughly the order of 100 times less for young Danes than it is for young American blacks. Now, but the lesson, let me say what the lesson of Nazi history we have in this country, and it will protect us. It's just the thing that makes this program possible. The First Amendment, which allows freedom of speech. If one believes that is not the right answer, then one has to be one of the most anti-German racists there can be. If one believes that the German people would have tolerated the concentration camps and the gas chambers, if news media like the programs that Mr. Brown is setting on, if those people were willing to bring discordant views out into the open, I don't believe the concentration camps and the gas chambers could have continued to exist in Germany.
I'd like to comment because I'd like to say that I don't think that there's a major difference between what Dr. Shockley is doing. I don't think that Dr. Shockley is fully aware of what he is doing and why he is doing what he's doing. But the long-range implications of what he is doing are no different than the propaganda campaign that Hitler and his Nazi unit carried on in Germany that ended up eliminating 6 million Jewish people. Now, what is most interesting is that Hitler said the very same thing. He said, number one, that the Jews were genetically inferior to the Aryans. Number two, he was aware that the Semites had genetically dominant material, genetic material to the Aryans. And if we begin to understand the way that people who were in Europe at the time that the Semites arrived from Africa, when the Semites arrived in Europe from Africa, they were people who had substantial amounts of color and who had very kinky hair because they were from the continent of Africa. And the Europeans, the white people who were there, had a reaction, a color reaction to the Semites that is no different than the reaction and the concern on the part of people who are white in this area of the world or any other area of the world to people who have the genetic capacity to produce color, who can genetically annihilate their position. And I think it's very, very important, even though Dr. Shockley, I am convinced that Dr. Shockley believes that he is perhaps elevating science with all of his charts and all of his figures, but he doesn't understand the things that propel him as a white individual in a social system that has programmed him throughout his life and programmed large numbers of people like him to focus on the genetics of people of color in such a way as to destroy people of color.
I would like to ask a question, and Dr. Shockley, if you could answer it yes or no, I would appreciate it. Do you believe that black people are inferior in intelligence because of their heredity?
I have a standard statement. It is not yes or no. It's memorized. I say at the same time every time I think. What I say is this. My research leads me, and it's a tragic conclusion really, my research leads me inescapably to the opinion that the major cause of the American Negro's intellectual and social deficits is hereditary and racially genetic in origin, and thus not remediable to a major degree by practical improvements in environment.
All right, if you believe that the position relatively of black Americans to white Americans is based on a genetic inferiority, and I will accept the responsibility for that word, then what do you see as the solution to the problem?
Well, I see the first aspect of this is to prevent the problem from becoming worse by dysgenics. This first word
Would
that
you
I
translate
mentioned.
dysgenics for me and the audience? Would that be sterilization?
No. Dysgenics, you see, means what that other chart I showed you says.
Should blacks,
the least effective element.
Should blacks be sterilized?
No. I have a...
But if blacks are a problem and we do not allow...
This is inhumane. And
Dr.
I think
Shockley
one can
wants
find more
black
humane
people to
solutions to this.
Well, then how would... Then
I would propose something in which one of the key clauses, phrases, is regardless of sex, race, or welfare status. And this is the proposal. I call it a thinking exercise. It's mentioned in that pamphlet that I showed that you can obtain. And it goes this way, that you would offer a bonus to everyone to be sterilized. Now, we know we have a population explosion problem. We know that in India that bonuses in the form of transistor radios are offered to people.
Would this bonus be directed to black people specifically, more than whites?
Mr. Brown, what did I say just a moment ago? I said, regardless of sex, race, or welfare status.
Now, there is a group...
Dr. Shockley.
That's what I say.
There is a group of white people to whom this offer should be made also.
Absolutely.
What
Now
group
the offer is based upon the best estimates, best scientific estimates that one can have of any genetically carried disabilities. Now there are some, I think, that any humane person would have no doubt about. And Dr. Welsing talked about dominant and recessive genes. I want to point out that sometimes a dominant gene can be a very bad thing, and it is a very bad thing for a neurological disease called Huntington's chorea, which is something
Which
like
is more
multiple
prominent
sclerosis.
in white people than black people.
That is correct. And I think that one should offer a large bonus for anyone who might be
Dr.
potentially
Shockley,
carrying Huntington's chorea.
Dr. Shockley,
Beyond
are you
this, it goes
aware-
on with some other factors in this, but Dr. Welsing wishes to speak.
Are you aware that white people have more genetic diseases that affect their nervous system than people of color, than black people?
I wouldn't be at all surprised, and I think
Now,
blacks
would you suggest that all of
problems.
these? Would you suggest that all of these white people who are carrying these defective genes, you know, whose families may carry these defective genes, that they be examined and it would be suggested to them that they be sterilized? Would you suggest this?
Yes, I think I would, probably, in general.
Go ahead, your Black Journal, please.
Of what we know about ancient black civilizations, how can American blacks suddenly be genetically regressive?
Thank you.
Let me just say this. What is very interesting is in the study of biology, biologists who have studied evolution, one of the very interesting things that they say is that the more functional skin pigment cells in the animal kingdom, the higher you are on the scale of phylogenetic ascension. In other words, nature in the course of evolution went to its highest state when it produced a cell that could produce pigment, and that we were sliding backwards. The mutation to albinism is a step backwards in the scale of evolution. Are you aware of that, Dr. Shockley?
No, I'm not aware of that particular one. I am aware of another basic genetic difference, and that is that the rate of maturation of a neurological system gets longer and longer the more advanced the animal is. And that is one of the items on the racial difference, that the neurological development of blacks is faster than whites. Black babies walk on the average a month earlier than white babies. And the period
and
of
black
gestation...
people are much more creative also than white
Dr.
people.
Wells, Shockley, correct me if I'm incorrect. Didn't the Giselle schedule, which tested the intelligence of children, make a correlative between intelligence and walking early?
Yes.
And I would think it probably would have been negative.
No,
No,
it was not.
positive.
It was positive.
Well,
The motor skills on the Giselle schedule indicated that earlier precocious walking children, there was a correlation between that and high intelligence.
This may be true. It might be true within a group. I'm not sure of that.
Well, maybe
I know that there is a correlation in terms of things earlier than walking. At the 6-month stage, Nancy Bailey at Berkeley has established that white children who come from the most advanced families and who later, when they become older, are out at the top. At the first 6 months, they are relatively retarded compared to children who are from families of less accomplishment and who don't go as far. But so there are a number of these things certainly to be brought in.
Fine.
But
Giselle schedule is a very authentic, accepted, institutional, psychological experiment.